Hey everybody, I'm Danny Grossman. Thanks for joining us for a special Zoom call carried over Facebook and YouTube, brought to you by World Mizrahi. We want to give you, our viewers, the opportunity to hear Professor Dershowitz, go one-on-one with his guests, and also get a chance, hopefully, to have your questions answered by Professor Dershowitz, one of America's greatest legal minds. He is a leading expert on criminal and constitutional law, civil liberties, and the Arab-Israeli conflict. Hi, Professor Dershowitz, and it is great to have you back again.
It's great to be here. I hope everybody's safe and staying home and doing all the right things.
So today's edition is a special one for Yom HaShoah, Israel, the Holocaust Memorial Day in Israel. And we want to join Professor Dershowitz for a time of discussion of contemporary anti-Semitism. So today he'll be in dialogue with special guests. It will be first is Ilan Carr, the U.S. Special Envoy to monitor and combat anti-Semitism. As Special Envoy, he advises the Secretary of State and is responsible for directing U.S. policies and projects aiming at countering anti-Semitism throughout the world. So Ilan, thank you very much for joining us. It is a true pleasure to have you with us, sir.
Well, thank you, Danny, and Professor Dershowitz. Alan, my good friend, thank you for having me. And I want to really say to Alan, in a world that is troubled not only by pandemics, but also by a dearth of moral clarity and courage, your voice, which is always a voice of moral clarity and courage, is not only sorely needed, but really the panacea for so many of our social ills. So I want to thank you, Alan, for what you bring to our country and what you bring to our world.
Well, thank you, but nobody standing alone is a panacea. This is an issue that is so deep that we all have to work together. It is so thrilling to know that the administration in Washington has appointed you to be in this ambassadorial post and to have the status of having the United States government stand behind you. Last night I finished watching the series on television called The Plot Against America, based on the novel by Philip Roth, which contemplates a time back in the 40s where Lindbergh gets elected instead of Roosevelt and the spread of anti-Semitism. And while I was watching that, I was actually thinking of you, Ilan. I was thinking of you, Ambassador, because in those days, the government stood with the perpetrators of anti-Semitism. Today, our government, and thanks to you, most governments around the world, stand strongly against anti-Semitism, some more strongly than others, to be sure. We had a great victory as Jews with the defeat of Jeremy Corbyn, and who is no longer the leader of the Labor Party, because he was the first person in post-Holocaust history who could have been elected to be the prime minister of a great American ally while expressing anti-Semitic, anti-Israel, and tolerating deep anti-Semitism within his party. So it was a great victory for decency and morality to see him defeated and replaced by somebody who actually has connections to the Holocaust. And so we're moving in the right direction, thanks to you, but there's no panacea. To be a Jew, I'm 81 years old, and everybody says I should retire. But to be a committed Jew means you can never retire, because it's never over. There's always, you have to look over your right shoulder, you have to look over your left shoulder. We're not paranoid. We have real enemies out there on the extreme right and the extreme left, and we have to work together to defeat them. And having the United States government behind that effort is unprecedented in modern history. And thank you for being such an important part of that.
Well, thank you, Alan. And I'm glad you pointed to the strength of this administration in that regard. I have to tell you a Yom HaShoah story. So 1 year ago, I was part of the first ever United States delegation to March of the Living. President Trump wanted the United States represented in an official capacity. And so I, along with 6 ambassadors, our ambassadors to Poland and Israel and Germany and so many other places, we stood arm in arm, shoulder to shoulder, and made that terrible, searing march between Auschwitz and Birkenau, together with thousands of students and faith leaders and clergy and professors. And I'll tell you, it was searing. I mean, you can't be in that place of death without being affected permanently. And every ambassador there was. And then a few hours later, we boarded a plane. and flew to Israel. And the next evening, we were again arm in arm and shoulder to shoulder, but this time not in a death march, but at the Kotel celebrating Shabbat. And I want you to know that for these ambassadors, I mean, you know, you and I, Alan, we've been to Israel a ton of times. For many of these ambassadors, it was their first time. Some of them were openly in tears because the contrast of the hell and the death and the evil of Birkenau, and then the light and the beauty and the magnificent human achievement that is the state of Israel, was a contrast that forever made us live that experience of going from darkness to light, from evil to goodness. And that's why fighting anti-Semitism also means fighting for the rights of the state of Israel and the Jewish people to have self-determination in the Jewish homeland.
These are remarkable events, and we bring thousands of students from the place of death to the place of life in Israel. It's an amazing experience for them. It does more than reading any number of books. You know, I've written books about Israel, and I'm proud of the books I've written. But when I bring students to Israel, it has more of an impact than any book you can ever write.
And it also drives home the point that the creation of the state of Israel wasn't simply a magnificent achievement in its own right. It is human history's most beautiful response to history's greatest evil. And that is a stunning reason for all the world to stand in defense of Jewish self-determination, of Zionism, and of the state of Israel.
Yes, Dan Diker, who is the Foreign Policy Fellow at the Jerusalem Center of Public Affairs. That's the JCPA, run by your colleague, Ambassador Dori Gold. And Dan is also a research fellow at the IDC, the Institute for Countering Terrorism at the IDC, run by my friend Boaz Ganor. And he's former Secretary General of the World Jewish Congress. And his recent book is called Israelophobia.
It's a marvelous book, Dan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador.
It is a marvelous book, I agree.
7 years ago, 1983, when Professor Dershowitz, who was the youngest tenured professor in the history of Harvard University since the early 1600s, I should say, he shepherded us, a number of us Harvard College students, into a meeting of the Palestinian Liberation Organization that had been sanctioned by what was called at that time the BSA, the Black Students Association. And a number of us Jews who had never felt or heard or experienced Israelophobia or anti-Semitism experienced both in that meeting because the PLO representatives refused to call on any Jewish student, any student with a Jewish last name, any student who looked Jewish, any student that had a Magen David or a kippah or any mark that would identify him or her as a Jew. And what Professor Dershowitz did was he suggested that all of the Jewish students get up in protest and leave together with him in an act of tremendous pride and integrity and Jewish self-confidence to leave that event and file a formal complaint with the administration, which we did. And I would like to take this opportunity to thank Professor Dershowitz, because I didn't have a chance 6 weeks ago when Professor Dershowitz was in Israel to help us launch the book Israelophobia in the West, to tell him that was really a founding moment for me. And little did I know that in 1990 I would make Aliyah and become observant, go to the yeshiva, and then end up writing this book. So the world and life has come around 15 years later, and Professor Dershowitz was really a rabbi for me, in a sense of helping me understand what Jewish self-worth and self-confidence was, and really was a foundational moment that for the next almost 4 decades would result in the writing of Israelophobia. And I think that today, which is Yom HaShoah, the Remembrance Day of the Holocaust, we're in the middle of a pandemic, the likes of which the world has not seen for 100 years, since the Spanish flu of 1918 that claimed millions of lives. And that was the last time that Jews were also accused of advancing that pandemic. And those accusations, what we call the Corona conspiracy, is the really the sum total of 2,000 years of accusations against Jews. But today we have, for the first time in the history, in the almost 73-year history of the state of Israel, the first time that the state of Israel is on the target list as being responsible for both engineering and spreading the coronavirus among its Palestinian neighbors.
Makes clear that so much of today, what passes as politically acceptable anti-Zionism, you scratch the surface just a bit, and it's classic anti-Semitism. The BDS movement is a perfect example. I am subject to the BDS movement. The founder, Balgudi, will not debate me. The Oxford Union invited him to debate me on BDS. He wouldn't do it because I'm a Jew who supports Israel. And that makes me subject to being boycotted. He doesn't want anybody to hear my views. And fortunately, I did have the debate at Oxford, and we won the debate, even though he wasn't there. They had a very good human rights who conceded basically many of the points that you've now made, that Israel is not an apartheid state, that it's a better human rights record than almost any other country in the world.
So our next two guests are together, and Olga Michaud-Washington, who is an attorney, corporate consultant, and the CEO of DEISI, the Defend, Embrace, Invest, and Support Israel. And
Great.
In Dan's book, she has a phenomenal chapter about the apartheid lie and the appropriation of South Africa's history. So before I go to you, I also want to introduce your husband, Joshua Washington, who writes about it from a completely different angle, from a completely different background. Joshua Washington is the director of Institute of Black Solidarity with Israel, the IBSI, and a composition graduate of the University of Pacific Conservatory of Music. He's a musician. His chapter is called Reaffirming Dr. Martin Luther King's Legacy. As we know today, people of our age, Alan and Dan as well, Martin Luther King was a staunch Zionist, but today that's being completely rewritten, that narrative, and it takes people with the conviction and the integrity and the courage of people like Joshua to stand up and correct that. So because the people who know and who read that will see how Dr. King championed security, self-determination, and territorial integrity.
One of the reasons I'm so passionate about the conversation, not only because of how it impacts South Africa, and I'll speak to that a little bit with regards to my contribution to the book, but as an African, I have seen how efforts by Israel to help Africa, that's a beautiful continent, we've got so many resources, a vibrant people, but are suffering for various reasons, and Israel over the years has offered assistance to us, how that assistance has been hampered by people who actually don't want to see us do well, but also who have taken our narrative and instead of saying, let's see what the solution can be with regards to the Palestinian people and the Israelis, have actually taken our narrative for purposes of demonizing and wanting to continue to delegitimize the existence of Israel. So my contribution to the book is reminding people of what the definition of apartheid is, because the way that it's been bantered around, people I've at least experienced, and even here on campuses, that they actually don't even know what apartheid means anymore. They've forgotten the fact or have no idea that it was a systematic way of, by way of legislation, over 150 codified pieces of legislation, separating and segregating people based purely on the color of their skin. I mean, I have stories where I personally, or with regards to my parents, couldn't do things, go to the same schools, ride public transportation system, access to hospitals, just because we were Black. And you don't see that in Israel. And also how, unfortunately, an icon such as former President Nelson Mandela of South Africa, how because he was sympathetic to the cause of the Palestinians, how they've taken that and they've forgotten the fact that he, even though he was pro-Palestinian, he wanted to see the Palestinian people also enjoy a life that they deserve. They've now taken that and said that he was anti-Israel. He was an anti-Zionist. Not true at all.
Not true. Yeah.
And he speaks even about the fact that Israel has the right to live in secure borders, but they don't speak to that. So highlighting the fact that just because you're pro-Zionist, it doesn't mean that you're anti-Palestinian. And then touching also a little bit on the fact that, you know, when you call Israel a colonizer, or say it's a colonial state, how you're actually doing a disservice and insulting the various African nations that were colonized. You know, so that had a double whammy. We were colonized by the British, and then we experienced apartheid as well. So I'm hoping that as people read the book, that they have a better understanding of why we cannot allow the apartheid Israel narrative to continue.
I know that Martin Luther King was a staunch Zionist, and even though that gets called into question sometimes, beyond that, there wasn't very much out there as far as Black support for Israel back during the Civil Rights Movement. And my father just happened to find some newspaper clippings and some other writings in a basement of a library one day of an organization called BASIC, Black Americans Supporting Israel Committee. And it was founded by Martin Luther King's one of his right hand men, Bayard Rustin. And Bayard Rustin is someone that we know a lot about, but BASIC, but there's not really a lot about BASIC out there on the internet. And so my father found it. He said he nearly cried. He immediately put it up online. It's all over the place now. And from there he started IPSI, which kind of echoed those same sentiments.
I was at the I Have a Dream speech in 1960, in violation of an order. I was a law clerk on the Supreme Court, and the Chief Justice said nobody who works for the judiciary can go to that speech. And I went with my judge. Both of us violated the order. I went down south and I participated in the civil rights movement in the summers of 61 and 62. And I remembered Bayard Rustin and his strong support for Israel. And Martin Luther King's famous statement, when you talk anti-Zionism, you're talking anti-Semitism, took place at Harvard. And so these are all part of my memory bank. And it's always been appalling to me how some, and you can't generalize, some leaders of the extremist groups in the Black community, the Panthers and others, turned against Israel. At Harvard, on the other hand, many of the leading professors, whether it be Charles Ogletree or whether it be Skip Gates, have always been pro-Israel, pro-Palestine. And so I think that it's so important for us to get back to the days of the civil rights movement when African Americans and Jewish Americans marched hand in hand against bigotry. And as Martin Luther King said, when there's bigotry against anyone, there's bigotry against everyone. So the movement to stop anti-Israel bigotry and anti-Jewish bigotry is part of the broader civil rights movement that we are all in together. And it's so important for us to speak to these issues in a united way. So thank you both so much for the work you do and for the efforts you make. And please call on me because I want to work with you on these matters. It makes me feel so good. It brings me back to the day in the 60s when I was working so closely with African-American leaders. So thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you.
We're all fighting bigotry. We're all fighting extremists on the right, and we're fighting extremists on the left as well. We're fighting violence, and we're standing together to try to make the case for moral clarity. And African Americans and Jewish Americans have so much more in common than we have differences. For me, Dan talked about what inspired him. I was 9 years old when Jackie Robinson came to play for the Brooklyn Dodgers. And for me, that was such a transforming event in my life because I thought of him as part of my people. Here we were being discriminated against. Jews were discriminated against in college admission. Blacks were discriminated against. And when Jackie Robinson came to bat for the first time, I remember saying to myself, if he can play second base for the Brooklyn Dodgers and hit 342 and be the Rookie of the Year and be the MVP, as a Jew from Brooklyn, I can do anything. There are no limits to where we can go. And Jackie Robinson inspired us so much. And I got to meet his wife later in life, Rachel. And I have pictures of only two people in my office, Thomas Jefferson and Jackie Robinson. It's ironic because Thomas Jefferson would have had Jackie Robinson as a slave, but nobody's perfect. But I love Thomas Jefferson and his writing of the Declaration of Independence, and I love Jackie Robinson. And I think so many Jews of my generation were inspired by him that I really want to go back to the time when we can work together and put aside our differences. There are going to be differences, but focus on the commonality and how we can fight the kind of bigotry that we're experiencing all over the world today, because it affects our communities equally. And I just want to thank all of my guests and those who have done so much on behalf of the struggle for justice for Israel, struggle for justice all over the world. And on Yom HaShoah, we just have to remember what the fruits of injustice can be. And the fruits of injustice are not just theoretical. They are what happened in the Shoah. And it's so important to stand together to make sure that never again means never again for the Jewish people, means never again for the African American and African people, means never again for so many people who have suffered bigotry and discrimination. We stand together against bigotry and in favor of moral clarity. So thank you all very much.
Close the program, I wanted to show as many people who are not familiar with me. Of course, I was an Air Force pilot, first in the US and in Israel, and I was privileged and honored really by you and by your colleague Erwin Cutler that at that conference at Jagiellonian University, the day before the March of the Living 3 years ago, I actually opened the March of the Living, speaking to 10,000 young people and presenting the very famous film, which I'm just going to show the last clip here of.
אנו, טייסי חיל האוויר הישראלים, בשמי מחנה הזוועות, קמנו מאפר ענייני הקורבנות, נושאים את זעקתם מצדיעים לגבורתם ומבטיחים להיות מגן העם היהודי מארצו ישראל.
That photograph hanging in my office. I don't let anybody come into my office without seeing that photograph of the Israeli Air Force flying over Auschwitz and thinking how the world would have been different if Israel had been allowed to come into existence 20 years earlier or 30 years earlier.